The City of Sunderland is an often underappreciated city, perfectly blending coastal beauty, a rich shipbuilding and mining heritage with an up-and-coming modern urban development. Its beaches, arts venues and historic landmarks have won multiple awards that have often been underappreciated or even ignored completely. However, despite its positives, Sunderland, like most places, also has a darker side, a side that is often hidden from view, a side that tells the unfortunate tale of debauchery, murder and death. And it is this side we are going to be focusing on in today's video. From a 9-year-old girl who was abducted and murdered in Penshire, to an infamous serial killer who terrorised young boys in the Monk, Weymouth and Roker area, I have gone through and researched all of Sunderland's most brutal, evil and twisted murders, the murders that shocked the city, leaving the people reeling and the city itself in despair, to showcase some of the most well-known and not so well-known cases to you in this video. Hello and welcome to the Diary of Madmen and Monsters, where we talk about the mad men, women and monsters that inhabit our society, covering well-known and not so well-known cases across the UK and beyond. And if you run on caffeine, true crime and swear words, you're in the right place and you're going to fit in well. Now, let's get ready because it's time for more true crime. August 25th, 1999 was supposed to be just another normal Thursday. 9-year-old Laura Kane woke up in her family's small home in Penshire, Sunderland. It was the last week of the school holidays and she planned to spend the afternoon playing outside, maybe visiting a friend down the street. She was one of those kids everyone in the area knew. Bright, polite, always smiling. What nobody knew that morning was that this would be the last time anyone would see her alive. At around 10:30 AM, Laura told her mum she was popping out to play. Her father, Paul, who was separated from Laura's mother, had been in court that very morning attending a custody hearing. By the time he got home, Laura was missing. Neighbours began searching immediately, knocking on doors, checking alleys, shouting her name into the evening air. Police joined the hunt and for 10 long days Sunderland held its breath. Posters went up across the northeast. Officers dragged rivers, combed woodlands and interviewed anyone who might have seen a small girl in a pink t-shirt playing in the area that day. Then, 10 days later, the smell hit them. On the 4th of September 1999, police searching a small tourist house in Merton found what they had been dreading. Beneath the floorboards of a back room lay Laura Kane's body, wrapped in a bedsheet, her small frame hidden under a layer of dust and wood. The man who put her there was Colin Bainbridge, a 34-year-old handyman and noted liar who lived just a few miles away. He wasn't a stranger. He knew the family. He'd been inside the family home plastering walls and fixing things for Laura's mum on the day of Laura's disappearance. He occasionally stopped by to chat and had even taken Laura's mum for a drink hours after murdering Laura. So Laura would have recognised him, trusted him, and that's how he got her, inviting her back to his home to meet his newborn baby. When police first knocked on his door, Bainbridge acted calm. He'd already been questioned multiple times, so he simply repeated what he had already told officers, that he hadn't seen Laura that day, even offering to help with the search. What he didn't realise, however, was that police had begun to tighten the net around him as a major suspect, and that they were growing more suspicious of his movements on the day of Laura's disappearance. Upon entering his home, detectives noticed something, the strong stench coming from his floorboards, and flies swarming near a corner of the room. When they pulled up the floor, they found her. The post-mortem revealed what Bainbridge had tried to hide. Laura had been assaulted and smothered, her body forced under the boards to rot. In interviews, Bainbridge spun a story that sickened even hardened detectives. He claimed Laura had stopped breathing during a tying up game when playing cowboys and Indians. But forensic evidence showed otherwise. She had fought back and Bainbridge had silenced her to cover his crime. At Newcastle Crown Court in June 2000, the jury heard every detail, the timeline, the lies, the concealment. It took them just hours to convict him of murder. Judge Nelson told Bainbridge, "You lured an innocent child into your home for your own gratification, and when you were done, you hid her like an object beneath your floor." He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 23 years. Outside court, Laura's mother wept as she spoke. She trusted him. She thought he was kind. "He's taken everything from us. Everything." The Kane family never recovered. Paul Kane later said he still blamed himself, that if the custody hearing hadn't kept him away that morning, Laura might still be alive. And as the years passed, the story of Laura Kane became a warning whispered across Sunderland, a story of a family betrayed by someone they thought was safe. "22-year-old Blaine Hammond wasn't some hardened criminal. He was a quiet lad from the Southwick area of Sunderland, good-hearted, a little lost, but trying to find his way. That Friday night, the 2nd of December 2021, he met up with two people he thought were friends, Lewis Whelan and Anthony Keating. Blaine and Anthony Keating had known each other for years, grown up in the same streets, shared the same circle, but this was the first time Blaine had met Lewis Whelan. The three of them ended up back at Whelan's flat on Saltburn Road, a cramped space that doubled as a hangout for local lads. They mixed alcohol with sleeping pills, smoked weed, laughed and argued, but as the night wore on, something shifted. A small disagreement over money, over pride, it doesn't matter. What matters is what came next. At 3:04 AM, CCTV outside the flat captured something horrific. Blaine, visibly unsteady, tried to leave. Whelan blocked the door. Then Keating launched forward, fists flying. For nearly 5 minutes, the two men punched, kicked and stamped on Blaine, slamming him into walls, dragging him across the floor. The noise echoed down the hallway. A neighbour would later tell police it sounded like furniture being thrown around, but it wasn't furniture. When it was over, Blaine wasn't moving. His head was swollen and bleeding, and Keating made off on his moped. Instead of now calling for help, Whelan did something almost unthinkable. He dragged Blaine's body out of the flats, down the steps, along a mud path, and dumped him inside a green telecoms box outside the building. The kind kids used to sit on, the kind nobody looks twice at, and then went back to his flat to chill. Hours later, at 9:30 AM, Whelan, hit with a pang of guilt, anonymously called for an ambulance, then headed off into the town centre. When police and ambulance services arrived, they noticed something strange, a trainer sticking out from the box. When police opened it, they found Blaine inside, unconscious, his face so badly beaten it was barely recognisable. He was pronounced dead at the scene at 11:50 AM. When officers arrested Whelan nearby, his hands were still bruised. He told them almost proudly, "He took my 20 quid, I've smashed him all over, he's on death's door like." Those words would later hang heavy in court. During the trial at Newcastle Crown Court, prosecutors called it a savage and prolonged attack, fueled by drink, ego and cruelty. CCTV footage played in silence as the jury watched Blaine being dragged like rubbish. One of the detectives, DCI Sharon Chatterton, said afterwards, "What we saw that night wasn't a fight. It was a beating, sustained, merciless and fatal." In November 2022, the jury found both Whelan and Keating guilty of murder. 2 months later, on the 25th of January 2023, they stood side by side in the dock as Mr Justice Morris handed down their sentence. Life imprisonment with a minimum of 14 years each. Blaine's mother, Lee, addressed the court through tears. "They didn't just take my son's life, they destroyed ours. I will never forgive them." October 7th, 1992. It was a cold Wednesday night in Sunderland's East End, the kind of night where the streets go quiet early and every window is dark by 9. Nikki Allan, just 7 years old, was walking home from her grandfather's flat in Weir Garth. She'd made that walk before. It was barely a few hundred feet to her own front door. But this time, she never made it. Nikki vanished somewhere between her grandfather's home and her own front door. Her mother, Sharon Henderson, who was following on behind her, reported her missing almost immediately. Friends and neighbours searched through the night. Police officers combed the estate, torch beams flickering through alleyways, stairwells and old warehouses. Then, the next morning, they found her. Nikki's tiny body was discovered inside the basement of the abandoned old Quayside Exchange building, a building only yards from her home. She had been lured into the dark, led down to the basement and then attacked, bludgeoned with a brick and stabbed 37 times to her tiny, innocent body. The weapon was never found. Her blood had pooled across the wooden floorboards. She'd been dragged through the building and her body left like a discarded doll in the dark. The murder of a child in her own neighbourhood, so close to home, sent shockwaves through the city. There was fear, fury and pressure. The police were desperate for an arrest, and very quickly they made one. A local man, George Hurren, was taken in. He was young, awkward and known to police. After initially denying any involvement, he was subject to intense questioning by investigators. Hurren, feeling extremely pressured, then confessed, but later said he'd been bullied and coerced into it. And so, the confession didn't match the forensic evidence. His case went to trial in 1993 and collapsed. The judge, realising his confession was forced, ruled that the taped confession to the murder was inadmissible in court. The judge blamed heavy-handed police tactics for this outcome. Hurren was found not guilty of Allan's murder and was then given a change of identity and moved out of Sunderland. With no other suspects and despite Nikki's mother's desperate attempts to keep the case in the headlights of police, the case went cold, and for nearly 30 years that's where it stayed, until 2017. New forensic techniques allowed police to re-examine evidence collected from Nikki's clothes. DNA had improved, so had the way it was read, and this time it pointed to someone else entirely, David Boyd. Boyd had lived in the same block of flats as Nikki's family back in 1992. He knew her. He'd even been seen with her in the days before the murder. At the time, he was questioned briefly, but never arrested. Now, however, the DNA brought him back into focus, and this time, the story stuck.
Can you do the same, just not to tell you off, just so you can hear what I'm saying? Thanks, mate. I'm Terry, this is Marty. We're part of the team that's re-investigating the murder of Nikki Allan. Yeah. Okay. Part of that investigation has led us to suspect that you may have had some involvement in that, okay? I'm arresting you on suspicion, okay, of that offence. You do not have to say anything, but it may harm the offence if you do not mention when questioned.
In 2022, Boyd was arrested and charged with Nikki's murder. He denied everything, but the trial painted a chilling picture of a man who had easy access to Nikki, who lured her to the warehouse under the cover of night and who killed her in a way that showed evil in a light that Sunderland had never seen before. In May 2023, more than 3 decades after Nikki's murder, David Boyd was found guilty. The courtroom fell silent as the verdict was read. Nikki's family wept. Her mother Sharon said she had waited half her life for justice, and finally it had come. Boyd was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 29 years. For Sunderland, the case had never really gone away. Nikki's photo with her brown hair, blue eyes and radiant smile had circulated the city for years. Every child from the estate grew up hearing her name. Every parent remembered the fear, because Nikki Allan wasn't killed by a stranger lurking in the shadows. She was murdered by someone she was familiar with, who had known her and pretended to be a friend. It's hard to imagine what kind of hatred drives a man to destroy another like this. But in September 2013, on a quiet country road near West Rinton, police found the results of something almost beyond comprehension. A body dumped in a ditch, beaten, mutilated and left for dead. That body belonged to 45-year-old John "Johnny" Hall, a father, a friend, and by all accounts a decent man. In the early hours of Sunday 15th of September 2013, a dog walker spotted something strange near a hedgerow, a car door half open, a trail of blood leading into the ditch. When officers arrived, they made a discovery that seasoned detectives later called the worst they'd ever seen. Hall's face had been caved in, his throat slashed and his body mutilated, injuries so savage that at first they weren't sure who he was. The investigation quickly led police back to Shiny Row, a small community on the outskirts of Sunderland. There, in a modest semi-detached house, detectives found the scene of the killing. Blood splatter across the walls, smashed furniture, and a baseball bat bent almost in half. The men responsible were Nicholas Rourke, 45, and Stuart Smith, 42. They weren't strangers. They'd been drinking with Hall that night. Old acquaintances bonded by drink and bad tempers. At some point, something was said, a rumour, a name, an insult, and it was enough. What followed wasn't a fight, it was a beating. Forensic evidence later showed that Hall had been stabbed in the face with a fork and was then hit with a baseball bat dozens of times across his body, with such force that bones shattered and organs ruptured. When he fell, the assault didn't stop. They stamped, kicked and struck until his body could take no more. Then, in a grim attempt to cover their tracks, they bundled him into a car, drove him out to the countryside and dumped him in that ditch like waste. When police arrested Rourke, his hands were swollen and bloodied. In interviews, Rourke said, "I did it with the baseball bat. I hit him lots. I released all my demons. I did feel better." Later adding, "It's been on my mind for the last 20 odd years." Despite his confessions during the trial, he pleaded not guilty and denied everything. But his own flatmate told officers Rourke had walked in that morning muttering, "I think I've gone too far this time." And co-accused Smith said he heard Rourke saying, "I've waited 23 years for this and God has had his justice." At Newcastle Crown Court in spring 2014, the jury listened to every gruesome detail. The prosecutor told them this was not a momentary loss of control. This was a prolonged, sadistic act of violence. Witnesses gasped when they heard the full extent of the injuries. Hall's face flattened, his body mutilated beyond recognition, so much so that even seasoned officers struggled to look at the crime scene photos. One of the most harrowing parts of the crime was that there was no real motive established, with both men repeatedly telling police they had no real understanding of why it had happened and minimising their own involvement. Even witnesses at the scene gave differing accounts of events, and the only certainty police had was that Rourke was the main culprit and that Smith had played a lesser role. On the 1st of April 2014, after weeks of testimony, the jury found Nicholas Rourke guilty of murder. His accomplice, Stuart Smith, was found guilty of manslaughter, spared the murder conviction only because the judge ruled he played a lesser role in the crime. The next day, Judge Moran addressed Rourke directly. "You showed no mercy. The violence you inflicted went far beyond what was necessary to cause death. This was an act of pure brutality." Rourke was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 19 years. Smith received 15 years for manslaughter. Outside court, John Hall's daughter said he was a good man, a loving dad, and he didn't deserve what they did to him. A third man, Paul Tate of Cambridge Road, Silksworth, was also charged with Mr. Hall's murder after it was found that he had cut his throat. But Tate committed suicide while on remand in Home House Prison in Stockton on September 27, 2013. In Sunderland, people still talk about the Johnny Hall murder, not just because of how brutal it was, but because of how ordinary it started. 3 men drinking in a house, one argument, and then the kind of violence that leaves even the hardest detectives silent. On a late summer evening in 2018, the quiet rhythm of a Sunderland convenience store was shattered. At around 9:55 p.m. on September 5th, 2018, 62-year-old Joan Hoggett was tidying the counter, getting ready to close up. She worked part-time at the one-stop shop on Sea Road, Fulwell, a small, friendly place where locals popped in for milk, bread or just a chat. She'd worked there for years, a grandmother, a mother, a woman described by everyone as kind, gentle and patient. But that night, as she straightened the aisles for the last time, a figure walked in, wearing dark clothes, gloves and a hood pulled tight around his face. In one hand he held his bag, in the other he carried a knife. That figure was Ethan Mountain, just 19 years old. To anyone watching from the outside he looked calm, collected even, but inside, Mountain's mind was fractured. He'd been battling paranoid schizophrenia for months, hearing voices that told him to kill. He'd already been in and out of psychiatric care, but on that September night he stopped taking his medication and gave in to the madness. What happened next lasted less than a minute, 50 seconds to be exact. CCTV footage later shown in court captured the entire thing. Mountain moved behind the counter. Joan turned, startled. He lunged. In a frenzied blur, he stabbed her 29 times, the blade striking her chest, neck, stomach and arm, causing fatal damage to her heart, lungs and intestines. The attack was so fast that by the time she collapsed, the shelves around her were splattered with blood. When paramedics arrived, Joan was still breathing, but barely. She was pronounced dead shortly after 10 p.m. Mountain fled the scene, leaving behind a rucksack filled with weapons, swords, knives and a mask. He was arrested some hours later after telling a friend he had committed a murder because the voices in his head told him to do it. His friend phoned 999 and the police then found Ethan wandering the nearby streets with blood still on his clothes.
Is it the police? How can I help?
My friend's been involved in an incident. He's got mental health issues. He said he stabbed someone kind of outside my house. We're currently in Whitburn Park, car park. And he's got blood all over him and he's cut himself a lot.
He's turned up at your address saying he stabbed someone and then...
He's turned up at my house with loads of blood all over him. I thought he got into a street fight or something, so I said, we'll come out, we'll go for a walk and talk about it. On the walk, he's explained the whole entire situation.
Okay.
I know where everything is and what's happened.
Right, so where has the original incident happened?
It happened in One Stop and Fuller Road.
When detectives asked why he'd done it, he gave no answer. He just stared. The trial at Newcastle Crown Court began in early 2019. The prosecution presented evidence so clear it could have ended on the first day. The CCTV, the forensic match, the confession. But there was another side to it. Mountain's mental state. Psychiatric evaluations revealed he was suffering from an acute psychotic episode, hearing voices commanding him to strike the devil. It wasn't the first time. He told doctors months earlier that he believed people were trying to kill him and that someone will get killed. But despite repeated warnings, he was released back into the community. So when the verdict came, it wasn't for murder. The judge ruled that Mountain's illness had destroyed his ability to control his actions. Instead, he was convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. On March 22, 2019, Mr. Justice Butcher sentenced him to an indefinite hospital order under the Mental Health Act, meaning he could spend the rest of his life inside a secure psychiatric facility. During sentencing, Joan's granddaughter Sarah stood in court, shaking but defiant. "Ethan Mountain has torn my whole family into a million pieces. We will never be the same again." The judge looked directly at Mountain and said quietly, "Your killing of her was a truly terrible event." Outside, candles were lit along Sea Road. Her colleagues left flowers and handwritten notes taped to the shop window. "You were our sunshine." It was the week before Christmas, 1988. 14-year-old Gaynor Batty had just finished school for the holidays. She was bright, outgoing and obsessed with karate. So much so that on Wednesday, December 21st, she left her home in Sunderland city centre to walk to her evening class at Cruelty Leisure Centre. It was a short walk, a few quiet streets, but she never made it. When Gaynor didn't come home, her parents, George and June, knew something was wrong. She wasn't the kind of girl to stay out late. Within hours, police and volunteers were searching the streets, calling her name, checking parks and bus stops. The next morning, a car park attendant made a discovery that would stop Sunderland cold. On the upper level of the Bridges Shopping Centre multi-storey car park, not far from the location of her karate class, lay Gaynor's body. She'd been assaulted and strangled with her own shoelaces. The scene was brutal. Detectives said it looked like she had fought for her life, skin under her fingernails signifying her attempt to fight her attacker off, torn clothing, defensive wounds on her hands. She'd truly put up a fight, but whoever had killed her had overpowered her completely. The post-mortem revealed she'd also been stamped on, her face fractured. It wasn't just murder, it was rage. For weeks, Sunderland was paralysed with fear. Police issued warnings to parents, patrols doubled in the city centre, and posters showing Gaynor's smiling school portrait were pinned up everywhere. The investigation was huge. Officers interviewed hundreds of people, chasing every lead. Then, months later, a name began to surface: David Lawson. Lawson was 20, local, known to police. He'd been seen near the leisure centre that night, loitering around the car park. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he didn't even deny killing her. He just said, "I didn't mean to, I panicked." But the truth was far worse than panic. At Newcastle Crown Court the following July, Lawson stood emotionless as the prosecution laid out what he'd done. He had followed Gaynor as she made her way to her lesson. When she entered the stairwell of the car park, he grabbed her, forced her to the ground and her. When she screamed, he strangled her with her own shoelaces, tightening them until she stopped breathing. Then, in one final act of violence, he stamped on her face before leaving her body where it fell. He pleaded guilty to murder, but tried to deny the The jury rejected his claim and found him guilty on both counts. On July 10th, 1989, the judge told him, "You have taken the life of a defenceless child in the most brutal and degrading way. You will go to prison for life." Lawson was just 20 years old. He would spend the next 2 decades behind bars, but no sentence could erase what he'd done. For Gaynor's parents, the grief never left. They described her as our little fighter, a girl who dreamed of becoming a karate instructor, who stood up for others in school. Her friends still remember the police tape around the car park, the whispers in the classrooms, the disbelief that someone could do something so monstrous to a child. When Lawson was eventually released on licence in 2015, after serving 24 years, public outrage erupted all over again. For Sunderland, it reopened a wound that had never really healed, because Gaynor's story wasn't just another headline. It was a reminder of how fragile safety really is, how one ordinary walk to a karate lesson could end in horror. And even now, decades later, people still remember her name, the smiling schoolgirl who never came home, and the monster who made sure she couldn't. Brent Martin thought they were his friends. On the night of August 23rd, 2007, the 23-year-old left his mother's house in Sunderland, not knowing it would be for the last time. Brent had a learning disability. He was gentle, warm-hearted and painfully eager to please. He didn't pick fights. He didn't understand cruelty. He just wanted people to like him. That night, he was with 3 young men: William Hughes, aged 20, Stephen Benally, 17, and Marcus Miller, just 16. Locals who Brent had tried to impress in the past. He'd bought them cigarettes, given them change, shared drinks with them. But what Brent didn't realise was that to these 3, he was never really a friend. He was a target. And on that summer night, they decided to make him a game. What followed wasn't an argument or a sudden explosion of violence. It was a deliberate, drawn-out campaign of brutality, carried out over more than a mile of public roads. Witnesses later described seeing Brent being chased, pushed, punched and kicked through the estate. The group mocked him, took turns beating him, and at one point one of them is said to have bet a £5 note on who could knock him out first. That was the value they placed on his life. As the assault escalated, Brent was stripped from the waist down, laughed at and repeatedly humiliated. He was seen stumbling through the streets with blood on his face, desperately trying to escape, too injured to run, too trusting to fight back. By the time they reached Baxter Road, Brent was barely conscious. What happened there would end his life. He was kicked repeatedly in the head and stamped on as he lay in the road. Neighbours later reported hearing shouting, followed by silence. When police arrived, Brent was lying unconscious on the pavement. He was taken to Sunderland Royal Hospital, where it was confirmed that his skull had been fractured in 18 separate places. His brain was so badly swollen that nothing could be done. He died the next morning. But the horror didn't end there. The group laughed and cheered themselves on, posing for pictures and then heading back to Hugh's flat, where they sat together, replaying the moment Brent was beaten to death in their own minds, like it was some kind of joke, like it was entertainment. All three were arrested within days. When they appeared in court, none showed any real remorse. The prosecution described the attack as sustained, gratuitous and humiliating. The judge called it savage, sadistic and deeply disturbing. On February 29, 2008, all three were found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Hughes received life with a minimum term of 22 years. Benally got 18 and Miller was sentenced to a minimum of 15 years. Outside the courtroom, Brent's mother sobbed. As well-wishers popped champagne, Mrs. Martin said, "I'm just very pleased with the verdict. The judge was brilliant. The government has to listen to murder victims' families." To this day, the murder of Brent Martin remains one of the most shocking examples of targeted cruelty in modern British criminal history. A young man with a childlike trust in others, destroyed by those who saw his kindness as weakness and his vulnerability as an opportunity. Barry Sewell was a man of routine. At 49, he kept to himself. He'd struggled for years with mental health issues due to turning to drink after the grief of losing his loving wife to cancer. He was vulnerable, both emotionally and physically. But he wasn't dangerous. He didn't provoke anyone. He lived quietly in Sunderland, making do, getting by, and trying to stay out of trouble. But one cold October day in 2004, someone brought trouble to him. It was October 8th and Barry was passing time in a run-down barn he had made into a makeshift home. Little did he know, evil was stalking the streets in search of him. The man doing the stalking was 21-year-old Brian Kearney, younger, fitter and volatile. On the surface there was no clear conflict between them, but Kearney didn't show up to talk, he came to kill. That day, Kearney had dressed deliberately for what he was about to do. A hooded jacket pulled tight, a belt loaded with weapons, at least 3 knives, a spanner and a hammer. He cycled to the barn carrying them all, every item chosen for violence. And when he arrived, he ambushed the unsuspecting man, launching into a savage and sustained attack. Barry was struck multiple times with a hammer, shattering his jaw and skull. He even dropped a 15-kilogram breeze block onto Barry's unconscious head, shattering his skull further. He then took a metal pole and, bringing it down onto his body repeatedly, broke Barry's kneecaps and shins before using it to pierce his bowels and stomach. There were over 36 injuries in total. Forensic pathologists would later describe the assault as brutal and relentless. It wasn't just about killing Barry, it was about destroying him. After the murder, Kearney didn't run. In fact, he told police almost immediately. He walked into a station and said he had stumbled across a body while out on a bike ride, denying any involvement. But when the killing suit was found by detectives in his mother's shed, he confessed and finally pleaded guilty shortly before his trial. In mitigation, his barrister said as a child Kearney had been a victim of sexual assault, including rape, and was totally out of control when he unleashed the terrible violence, and that he had launched into a fury after hearing rumours in a pub that Barry Sewell was a paedophile, which is why he had gone to confront him. Claims that were later found to be completely baseless. Despite further claims that Kearney had been acting in self-defence, the evidence told another story. The number of weapons, the preparation, the frenzied overkill. This wasn't a spontaneous act, it was planned, and it was deeply personal. At trial, the jury rejected Kearney's versions of events. They saw through the excuses. In December 2005, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years. The judge told him he was dangerous and calculating, and made clear that Barry's vulnerability had been exploited, not provoked. For Barry's family, the outcome brought some closure, but not peace. Barry hadn't deserved what happened to him. He hadn't started a fight. He hadn't threatened anyone. He was a man living a quiet life, ambushed and killed in a barn by someone who brought an arsenal to the meeting. To this day, Barry's name is rarely mentioned in headlines or documentaries. His story faded quickly, but the facts remain. A young man armed himself with blades and blunt force weapons, sought out a vulnerable victim, and ended his life in a storm of violence. On the morning of April 18, 2008, officers entered Harbour Lodge on North Bridge Street in Sunderland, a homeless hostel actively being used by Sunderland Council to help home those who needed it. The scene that greeted them was like walking into a slaughterhouse. Down in the basement bedroom, in the darkness beneath the creaking floorboards, officers found two men, lifeless, beaten so badly their faces were unrecognisable. Their names were Wayne Pearce, 41, and Brian Pallister, 44. Both were local men, known around the city, sometimes sleeping rough, sometimes staying in the very hostel where they died. They were friends, drinking partners, survivors of hard lives, and yet someone had decided they didn't deserve to live another day. The murder weapons were found nearby. 2 shovels snapped in 3 places, caked in blood and hair. The attack had been frenzied, every blow delivered with enough force to crush bone. Police described it as savage and prolonged. Whoever had done it wanted to make sure they were dead and wanted them to suffer getting there. For days the crime scene stayed sealed off. Detectives worked around the clock, piecing together what had happened inside that dingy basement bedroom. Rumours spread fast. Some said it was a drug deal gone wrong. Others whispered about debts, betrayals and revenge. But no real motive would ever be established, leaving the city to fill the blank space with speculation. By November that year, police made their move. 2 men, Peter Pearce, Wayne's own cousin, and William Crichton, both from Sunderland, were charged with murder. The betrayal was staggering. Family turning on family, friends killing friends. Both were arrested and charged with the double killing of Wayne and Brian, and both men initially denied murder, feigning ignorance and blaming the drug-induced stupor they were in for the lack of ability to remember events correctly. Police took multiple statements from the suspects themselves and other witnesses who were present in the building that day. The picture was hazy, with Pearce and Crichton both insinuating the other one had done more of the damage than themselves. What's known is this. Detectives believed Wayne and Brian were beaten to death during a drunken argument that spiralled into something monstrous. The 2 accused had been seen with them in the hours before their deaths. Witnesses later told police they'd heard shouting from the basement, the sound of metal striking concrete, and then silence. When police arrived at the scene, the 2 dead men were barely recognisable. They'd been bashed and chopped to a pulp, with a ferocity rarely seen in such cases. One detective later described it as the kind of scene you never forget. You can see it every time you close your eyes. To this day, the full truth of what happened in that basement has never been made public. Whether through lack of evidence, silence or fear, the outcome remains hidden in the court archives. What we do know is that Pearce had told the jury during his trial that he was not responsible for either murders, and that he watched in horror as Crichton carried out both killings. Crichton, however, had told jurors it was a mess, a complete mess. There was just loads of blood. I just saw what he had done to Wayne. He had battered him all over. He added, "It was horrible. I've seen people beaten up and that, but I've never seen anything like that. Never ever." Upon cross-examination, Crichton said he remembered so little about the events in question, so little in fact that he might have been responsible for killing Mr. Pallister. But, he added, "If I did, I can't explain, but I know I never did Wayne." Jurors also heard the police interviews with Crichton, in which he told them, "Let's get this over and done with. He," referring to Peter Pearce, "done Wayne and I done Brian." But Crichton tried to diminish his confession in court by claiming he remembered little about the interviews as his head was all over the place at the time. After 13 days of testimony, on the 6th of November 2008, the jury retired to deliberate and after only a couple of hours found William Crichton guilty of both murders, and Peter Pearce was convicted of the murder of his cousin Wayne Pearce, but acquitted of the murder and manslaughter of Mr. Pallister. Both men were then handed life sentences for their crimes, with Pearce being given a minimum term of 15 years and Crichton a minimum term of 30 years. This case shook the very foundations of the city, and when locals talk about the old hostel on Northbridge Street, there's still a pause, a chill, as if the ghosts of Wayne Pearce and Brian Pallister never really left that building. At first, no one connected the deaths. It started in 1990 when a teenage boy named Simon Martin was found dead in the derelict Gilside house in Roker, Sunderland. He was just 14 at the time. Police treated it as a tragic accident, maybe drugs, maybe a dare gone wrong. There were no immediate signs of foul play, no suspect and no motive. In reality, police failed to spot the strangulation marks on his neck and theorised that he had died within 48 hours of the discovery of his body, when he had actually been dead for a week. Unfortunately for Griefson's future victims, the case went cold. But over the next 4 years, 3 more boys, all teenagers, all from the same area, would meet the same fate. Each one vanished without warning. Each one turned up dead in hidden abandoned places around the city, and each one had been strangled. By the time police realised they were dealing with a serial killer, it was almost too late. The second victim was 18-year-old Thomas Kelly, found in an abandoned allotment shed in 1993. Like Simon, he'd been partially undressed, strangled, and left in a place where no one was likely to find him. Griefson had even set the body on fire. Approximately 4 months later, 15-year-old David Hansen disappeared after a night out. His body was also discovered in an abandoned building, hidden under debris. A few weeks after that, another teen, 15-year-old David Grief, was found murdered in similar circumstances. Sunderland was gripped with fear. These weren't random attacks in dark alleys. The killer was luring boys into quiet, derelict spaces and leaving their bodies behind as if they meant nothing. And for years, no one knew who he was. But there was one thing linking the cases, a pattern. The killer was targeting young men, mostly students, and hiding evidence in a way that suggested both planning and panic. Eventually, forensic teams began to piece things together. Fibres, footprints, and the distinctive way the victims had been tied up. By early 1994, police had a name: Stephen Griefson. Griefson was 24 years old, from Fulwell in Sunderland. To the outside world, he looked like any other working-class young man, quiet, reserved, a bit of a loner. But behind closed doors, Griefson was living a double life. He was a deeply closeted gay man in an era and place where being openly gay carried real stigma, and he would later tell psychiatrists he'd killed to keep his sexuality secret. When police searched his home, they found items belonging to the victims: clothing, personal effects, even newspaper clippings about the murders. Under questioning, Griefson cracked. He admitted to killing the 3 boys found in 1993 and 1994, but for years he denied involvement in the first murder, Simon Martin. It wasn't until 2013, 2 decades after Simon's death, that Griefson finally confessed. He'd known Simon. They'd gone into the building together. According to his statement, when he thought Simon might go on to reveal his sexuality, he panicked and strangled him. In total, Stephen Griefson was convicted of 4 murders, 3 of which he was convicted for in 1996, and the 4th in 2013. He was given multiple life sentences with a minimum term of 35 years. At trial, the judge called him a dangerous and calculating killer who murdered innocent boys to hide his own truth. Griefson never showed real remorse. Even in court, he spoke in short, flat statements. The families of his victims sat through the hearings in silence. 4 sets of parents who had buried sons without knowing why. The case of the Sunderland strangler still echoes through the city, not just for the horror of what he did, but for how long it took to see the pattern, to hear the truth, and to finally give those boys the justice they'd been denied for years. At this point in the video, I just wanted to offer my deepest condolences to all of the friends and family of the victims. May all of the victims we have spoken about in this video today rest in peace. And there you have it, 10 of the most evil murderers Sunderland has ever seen. And if you took something from this video, watch out for part 2 coming soon. And also, feel free to watch the video on screen now, where I showcase 16 of the most evil, violent, despicable murderers jailed for their crimes in October 2025 in the UK. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, when it'll once again be time for more true crime.